Welcome to Undercurrents, a daily news show from Unheard. I'm your host, Emily Jashinsky. Arch-Republican Dick Cheney is voting for Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris. His daughter Liz Cheney is apparently doing the same. Here's what she said on ABC News this Sunday.
You have many Republicans out there who are saying, well, we're not going to vote for him, but we will write someone else in. Right. And I think that this time around, that's not enough, it's important to actually cast a vote for Vice President Harris.
Over on NBC News, independent Senator Bernie Sanders applauded the Cheneys.
Cheney and I agree on nothing, no issues. But what we do believe in is that the United States should retain its democratic foundations. And it's not just Cheney. I think there is a significant number of Republicans who say, well, I may not agree with the vice president on this issue or that issue, but I cannot support somebody who's a pathological liar, somebody who fomented a insurrection to overthrow the election return. So I applaud the Cheneys for their courage in defending democracy. Obviously, on all the issues, we have very different points of view.
American media is furiously framing these endorsements as a significant statement on the Republican Party, proof that Donald Trump made the GOP so toxic that even Dick Cheney could no longer stomach it.
I hear you about endorsements. We don't really know the impact that they have all the time. RFK Jr. hasn't been in elected office. Dick Cheney was Vice President of the United States for 8 years. He was a senior member of the House. He was Chief of Staff to Gerald Ford. He worked tirelessly to advance Republican policies for a long time. You don't think his endorsement of a Democrat with that kind of pedigree is going to make a difference with swing voters?
I really don't.
But what if the real story is that the Cheneys made the Republican Party toxic to Trump voters? After flipping on Trump in the wake of January 6th, Liz Cheney got trounced in her House primary just 2 years ago. Trump's original primary victory in 2016, in which he bested the leading candidate, Jeb Bush, was a clear, resounding rejection of the Bush-Cheney legacy on wars and immigration and entitlements. As I wrote in Unheard just last week, actually, it's unlikely the Cheneys will swing any votes at all. Undecided voters aren't the kind of people who listen to these two. Even so, the Cheney arc shows how deeply self-described, quote, limited government conservatives like Liz Cheney care about what they call democracy. And the media is now eagerly accepting lectures on so-called democracy from people they long saw as threats to democracy, merely because the Cheneys finally agree with journalists on Donald Trump. So is Trump the threat to democracy, or can two things be true? Might both have tendencies to be anti-democratic, and elites are just choosing to ignore them from people who now oppose Trump? To talk more about this, I'm excited to be joined by Marshall Kosloff, host of the Realignment podcast. Marshall, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Marshall, if you could you love history, take us back to before Donald Trump actually announced he was running for president. Refresh our memories, especially since some listeners and viewers actually may not have been alive. How did people in the media, and especially sort of your mainstream Democrats, talk about Dick Cheney before Trump was sort of even a thing in American politics?
Yeah, Dick Cheney represented, I would say, one of the primary villains of the George W. Bush years. Because at the end of the day, obviously, George W. Bush's presidency was one that the American people firmly rejected, and obviously the Democratic Party was very against. But George W. Bush was always likable as an individual. He was always, especially, winning the, who wants to get a beer with me question 2000 versus Al Gore. Dick Cheney, by contrast, did not have the likability. So you had the fact that he was just not a popular politician, combined with the fact that he was so attached to things like Halliburton and the Iraq War and energy policy during the Bush administration. So very much seen as a villain. We should really think about, the 2018 movie Vice as representing like the real consensus center-left position on it.
Marshall, you host a podcast that is literally called The Realignment, and it's hard to imagine. I mean, if you had explained 10 years ago that Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz Cheney were going to be voting for the Democratic presidential nominee, a lot of people would have been like, well, what are you talking about? Did the Democrats become really moderate? Or did the Republicans become too moderate for Dick Cheney? And the answer is sort of a combination of all of that, with also Republicans becoming too, as Cheney would say, too extreme, as both Cheneys would say, too extreme. But what's the truth? I know that's a huge question. It's just hard to describe both parties? I mean, this is what you do in your podcast, like where both parties actually are.
Yeah, I honestly think this has been you frame the question the right way, but I think the overall question's been gotten a little bad faith because, like, let's remember something. George H.W. Bush voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So, and Dick Cheney was famously George H.W. Bush's defense secretary before he became VP under H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush.
Although he voted for Trump in 2016.
Yeah, well, and the thing is that it wasn't as if actually he actually didn't vote for the top line ballot in 2016. But my point is, even if you've gone back 10 years ago, the idea that there'd be different types of Republican responses to the Trump era and basically saying the only question that matters here was like up or down, Trump or not. So I just don't think it's that crazy that both Cheneys would end up in this position, given where they fit in the party. They're foreign policy hawks. They are not populist on economics at all. I just think they're seeing this as a very binary up and down thing, which is basically the same thing RFK Jr. is doing. We can find all these different questions that RFK Jr. seems out of step from Trump on, but at the end of the day, when it comes to the things he actually cares about, is driven by, it's an up or down question. So I think this is just a pretty realistic approach to politics, and I think it'd be annoying for us to kind of claim that like this is the craziest thing that's ever happened. It's actually pretty consistent. And frankly, the last thing I'll say is, at least with the Cheney never Trumpers, they're taking their rhetoric seriously. So if they think democracy is at stake, if they think America's role in the world is imperiled under Trump, they are obviously just going to vote for the other party who isn't that person. I think it's really annoying when you have never Trumpers who say all of the apocalyptic rhetoric, but then are like, I'm writing in Ronald Reagan. That at all, like, it's not consistent at all. And I find them much more ridiculous than the Cheneys who would say, look, on most things we're against them, but on this one big thing, the question of Trump, I'm not there with it.
So let's talk about the question of, quote, democracy, though, because that's what their stand-in for Trump is. That's what they say. As you just pointed out, that's the kind of red line that they've explained, is that they will vote for someone who Liz Cheney described as a radical liberal just a few years ago, because after January 6th, Donald Trump became too big a threat to, quote unquote, democracy. Now, on the other hand, a lot of people in the media thought the Cheneys, and a lot of people on the left, frankly, thought the Cheneys were a threat to, quote unquote, democracy for a long time. There are, plenty of articles you can find of Dick Cheney being decried as a war criminal, which would hardly be in line with a sort of democratic moral standard bearer. So what does, and I'm trying to ask this question in good faith actually, what does that tell us about how people in the press and people who are allied with the Cheneys see lowercase d democracy?
So two things here. Number one, the immediate takeaway from what you just said, because you and I came of age politically during the Bush years. So I think we understand this. The democracy at stake rhetoric got out of hand during the 2000s and during the 2010s. That very clearly is true. And frankly, you have members of the Democratic Party like voting not to certify elections after 2004 that also were playing games that shouldn't have been played. So clearly the 2000s were out of control, to sum it up that way. I'll also note, though, a lot of that was also coming out of like the Supreme Court decision that effectively gave George W. Bush the presidency in 2000. So things were just pretty out of whack. I will say, though, that like once again, this is just my defense of the Cheneys. I understand if you're on the right and you just do not think that January 6th was like a line crosser. They do. They think that in of itself, the refusal to certify the results, the efforts in different states with the electors, if that's their red line, it makes sense that, yes, Kamala Harris is going to do some energy policy things that make me uncomfortable. Yes, she's not going to arm Ukraine as aggressively as I'd want to. At the end of the day, all that really matters here is the question of, like, does the president actually have the judgment to accept a contested election? And I think that's a totally legit way to actually frame it that way. I'll also note, too, and this is also why I think, to be honest, Liz Cheney made this a little more confusing. The defense of Dick Cheney is also that, like, look, Republicans are probably going to take the Senate. They could probably keep the House. This is going to be 4 years of logjam. And during that time, the Republican Party could get normal again. From the Cheney perspective, Liz Cheney endorsing Colin Allred in Texas confuses that message a little bit. If you're just like a traditional, like, normal conservative doesn't like Trump. But I'd say that's like the overall way to understand the picture.
So it's interesting because, the threat of a, quote, radical, it sounds like the Flight 93 calculus that a lot of people on the right made as you're describing it, which I think is an accurate description of how they're seeing this in their head. That was famously written by Michael Anton, saying that Hillary Clinton represented such a threat that even the unknown quantity of Donald Trump was worth voting for over a Clinton presidency. And that's kind of interesting with Cheney, is she's not just saying you can't vote for Trump. She's saying you have to then also vote for Kamala Harris. But in the context of what you were just saying about actually Ukraine policy, potentially immigration policy, It actually seems like the Cheneys have gradually been moving, or Democrats have gradually been moving closer to a place where the Cheneys would be more comfortable anyway, even with a quote-unquote radical liberal like Kamala Harris. Is there anything to that, Marshall?
Yeah, so this is where the realignment really matters. So if we're looking at, let's say, foreign policy and hawkishness towards Russia, hawkishness towards China, obviously there are all sorts of gaps between the Republicans and the Democrats when it comes to both of those questions, like in both directions. There are some people in DC who say that Joe Biden is too accommodationist towards Russia, and the same way there are people who say he's too aggressive about Ukraine. There are people who say that people on the more traditional Glenn Greenwald left who would say that, like, oh, Joe Biden's like a saber rattler when it comes to China and Taiwan, and Nancy Pelosi shouldn't be taking all these trips. All that said, broadly speaking, part of the realignment is the Democratic Party has clearly regained a bit of its hawkish roots in a way that just wasn't quite true as much during the 1990s and the 2000s. And once again, and this is also why I appreciate you working hard to keep this good faith. I'm not a huge fan of this whole, like, well, back in the 1960s, like the left said this, or back in the 1980s, the right said that. Like, issues change, people change, the orientations of the parties change, the American voters change in their actual expectations. And it's actually a proof that we have like a dynamic and functional party system. Donald Trump would say, hey, like, guess what? The GOP is going to be more populist now. People don't want 1980s Reaganite policies. It makes sense that Democrats would say, hey, like, an opinion we had on the war on terror, like let's say the Iraq war, is kind of actually a little different from the question of, hey, like, what's our policy towards Taiwan? What's our policy towards Russia? I think it's really important that we both recognize that rhetoric could get overheated, but we also at the same time say, hey, parties have to respond to the world as it shifts.
Do you think the Cheneys, given their long support for, let's say, the war in Iraq, what a lot of people objected to deeply when it came to quote-unquote enhanced interrogation, I forget if that was a Rumsfeld description or a Cheney description. I think it was Cheney. But people say that you don't have a lot of credibility then when you're talking about lowercase d democracy. Do you think, though, there is a contingent of voters who look at this and for them the Cheney endorsement really matters, changes their mind, or makes them feel like they have perhaps a political home in the Democratic Party or with some other homeless Republicans? Are they reflecting the sentiments of a real chunk of the American electorate or even of the American public? I say that because it's different from the electorate. It may actually reflect some people who don't want to vote this election, period.
Yeah, so I don't think there are a huge contingent of on the fence swing voters who are going to come charging out of their houses to vote for Kamala now because of the Cheney's endorsement. But I think clearly they represent a certain part of the Republican Party's coalition. Let's say these were hardcore Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan voters. Probably they live in the suburbs like Virginia, suburbs in Texas, different states like that, who are now coalition members with the modern Democratic Party while Trump is on the ballot. And the key defense of, if I were Kamala Harris, I wouldn't have said I'm honored, to take, the Cheney's endorsement, given the Iraq war dynamics you just described. But the actual truth that the acceptance of the endorsement is getting at is that there's just a huge number of voters. And these are voters that Kamala needs to turn out who are basically only voting on one single issue. It's not, hey, does Kamala Harris have a great plan to deal with childcare? It's not like, hey, like, how is Joe Biden? It's basically, we want Donald Trump to go away. These are the voters who she was speaking to with that initial, like, never go back slogan. So I think the Cheneys definitely speak for a set of voters. But the key thing too is that these voters are also already pretty polarized. So I don't think these voters were undecided already, but they do I do just beef a bit when people claim that the Cheneys are irrelevant. They're not relevant when it comes to turnout, but they do represent something that is going to be a long-term thing for the Republican Party to think of. And this will be a serious debate whenever Trump actually leaves, because the country's so contested right now. It's so 50-50 that there will be Democrats who say to ourselves, hey, how do we keep a formerly red Mitt Romney voter who just thinks the Republican Party is wackadoodle in the coalition once we can't just say up or down, Trump or not? So that's not an interesting question right now, but it would be an interesting question in 2028 moving forward.
Well, you're the best person to talk to about that, because there are a lot of takes circulating right now that the parallel between a Kennedy endorsing Trump and the Cheneys endorsing Harris is as stark and definitive of a characterization about where the two parties have gone that you can find. My personal take on that is the jury is still out. These wars are still ongoing within each party. And I'm curious what you think about that, Marshall, because it does seem to be very stark at first that you have an anti-war Kennedy, environmentalist Kennedy getting on board the Trump team, and then you have the very hawkish Cheneys getting on board the Harris team. So is this a sign that the war within the parties is over, or is the jury still very much out?
The jury is still out because this is all ultimately just about Trump. Like, let's be clear here. RFK Jr. wouldn't be endorsing Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley's Republican Party. This is why Trump has politically survived the past 10 years. He is able to be both radical and kind of weirdly centrist. I'd kind of describe Trump as having this alt-center appeal. Like, there's a reason why all the IDW people are now like aggressively posting how Trumpy they are. So like if a person like RFK, the thing is when we separate your question, the question of where Cheney style bulwark dispatch subscribing like never Trumpers end up is a legitimate question that's going to matter long term. I think RFK Jr. is just sort of like such a unique special case. He doesn't fit within any.
Although there's Tulsi
right?
Gabbard too.
Yeah, well, I mean, Tulsi's a little more complicated because Tulsi clearly has been like sort of with her realism in like the 2010s, like, and the fact that when Tulsi was back in Hawaii local politics, she was very conservative. So like Tulsi, let me put it this way, Tulsi comfortably has a long-term space in the Republican Party. RFK Jr. doesn't, and that's the way I'd separate the two of them.
That brings me to the last question I wanted to ask Marshall about how you're seeing somewhat of a realignment in Silicon Valley, the David Sachs of the world, the Winklevi, if we're referring to them by their proper plural, twins coming out in support of Donald Trump over crypto. So on the one hand, you have some of those, I guess I would say alt-center type people going full MAGA. It's kind of impossible to define the politics of someone like David Sachs, like a realist, pro-business type of person. But then on the other hand, you have people following the kind of Cheney mold and saying, Donald Trump himself is the center issue. That's why you have to go with Harris. Is that the distinction between, the decision making on both of these people? Like if we got David Sachs to debate Liz Cheney, would it be their central disagreement is over whether Donald Trump as a person, as a human being, his psychology is fundamentally a threat to the American Republic? Is that what this is?
David Sachs is kind of a useful and unuseful example here, though. So, for example, if Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, and David Sachs got in a room, they wouldn't be fighting about Trump. They'd be fighting about Ukraine. Just because, like, David Sachs is unique in that sort of, like, Silicon Valley right for being as, like, realist and anti-U.S. foreign policy establishment as he is. Like, the Winklevi, to use the proper plural, as you said, like, they're not talking about foreign policy. Most of those people aren't interested in that category. And a lot of other people, like, Jacob Hellberg, who's sort of leading Trump foreign policy person who works in Silicon Valley, he's very hawkish on China in a way that I think David Sachs doesn't talk about China because it would just lead to awkwardness within the coalition. But like, that's just like sort of like the adjustment there. But I would say for most people, David Sachs aside, the argument is basically, is Donald Trump fit to be president? Yes or no? And that's the central determinant, because it's also funny too, because this always gets awkward for guys like Mark Cuban, because they've been forced into being, I think, operationally far more pro-Democrat than they necessarily are, because they found themselves on the question of like Trump, yay or nay. But critically, like Mark Cuban's a guy who very much is like, oh, I don't like either party. I was having my, lawyers see if we could use antitrust provisions to break up the two-party system. Like, they're very much people who are much more comfortable with think about it like this. If you're a Silicon Valley, like center-left reasonable guy, you were prepped for a Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton world, where you could just basically say like, okay, this is all boring. It's all these dynasties. I'm a tech guy. I'm anti-establishment. But then what ended up happening is the anti-establishment wing wasn't like no labels where a lot of those guys are comfortable. It's not Mike Bloomberg. It's not, Howard Schultz of Starbucks. It's actually Donald J. Trump and it's, RFK Jr. So it's just left like the Silicon Valley center left in such an awkward position right now that they're basically just pushing through. But I think whether or not Kamala wins or loses, they're going to find themselves in an awkward position in terms of what you do after Trump with their actual positioning.
You killed me with Donald J. Trump. I mean, just so respectful. Nothing but respect from Marshall. But actually, you bring up such an interesting point about the Cuban, Reid Hoffman bickering over whether Kamala Harris is serious about her economic policy that is absolutely uncomfortable for them right now.
all of these big questions we've been basically examining are best understood as Trump up or down. That's the only question anyone's actually focused on. And it's less helpful to basically say to people, wow, Dick Cheney supported the Iraq war. Like there isn't like a single voter who isn't already with Trump who is like voting on the Iraq war right now. So we should understand like what the actual political question is and how what you do moving forward.
Marshall Kosloff is host of The Realignment, and also just have to say, so adorable that you're broadcasting from our friend Sagar and Jetty's studio, which will be familiar to many people who watch Breaking Points and all of Sagar's other appearances, because man, does he love that bookshelf.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Marshall. We'll be back with more Undercurrents tomorrow. Make sure to subscribe for full versions of interviews just like this one. Subscribe to the Unheard channel, subscribe to the Undercurrents channel, and we'll be back here with more tomorrow.